divided in two parts, macro and micro, right? Now, what's the distinction between the two? So as I said, macroeconomics deal with issues, concepts that are related to the entire economy, right? Unlike micro, which looks at one market, sector, industry, right? So obviously, as it says, that microeconomics doesn't talk about the overall economy as a whole, right? So it doesn't talk about GDP, because GDP is not for one sector, it's for the entire economy. That is part of macroeconomics. Inflation, if you think of inflation rate in any country at any point in time is the same, right? So that's also macroeconomics. Exchange rate, inflation, right? Unemployment. So all of these are macroeconomic variables. Okay. Now, in this unit of macroeconomics, we'll talk about a couple of different things, right? So the first thing that we started off with was circular flow of income. Now, if you remember, we'll not go over it all over again, but we did discuss that circular flow of income is a graph. It's a model that shows how money circulates in an economy, right? So we said in any economy, there will be four sectors. What are the four sectors? Households. Households include people like you and me, who are ready to work. I'm like households basically provide labor services if they are they are mature enough to work in any company. Households also are the consumers who buy goods and services and so on, right? Then there are firms. Firms are basically companies, organizations that produce goods and services. Government role is simple. Government is more of a regulatory body in the country. And then there's international trade, like when you export and import with other countries, that's international trade, right? Then we said, if you remember, that in AS economics, we talked about, we know what GDP is, but the way we used to calculate GDP in AS economics was simply on the basis of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? So quick recap about this, right? So we said that AS economics, we learned that the GDP of a country, which is the total value of goods and services produced in an economy, that's based on the total demand for goods and services in the economy and total supply, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So on the y-axis, you will have general price level, which is the average prices in a country, right? So general price level is not the price of one good or service, it's the overall price level in that country. And on the x-axis, you used to have real GDP. So where aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves used to intersect, that was your macroeconomic equilibrium, right? Okay, now just a second, right? So upward sloping is your aggregate supply, which is total production in the country, and aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services in the economy, right? So where aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves intersect, that is macroeconomic equilibrium. And what does this macroeconomic equilibrium shows? It shows general price level, that what will be the prices of average goods and services in that country. So it shows you general price level, average price level in that country, and the real GDP, Y1, right? Are we good on this? Is this simple? Okay. Now, obviously, before we move forward, we need to know what aggregate demand is. I'll also write down the definition for you, and what is aggregate supply, right? And then we look at the components. So aggregate demand is made up of different components, and we'll talk about it, right? So let's first discuss this and then move forward. So basically what we are doing in today's class, we will talk about consumption and saving function. Now, why are we doing this? Let me give you some overview of this, because then it might be confusing for you. So after discussing the circular flow of income, which shows how money circulates in an economy, we said we will use this information to discuss Keynesian Cross. Now, what is Keynesian Cross? Keynes was a very, Keynes is a complete school of thought. Keynes is a school of thought in economics, right? And Keynesian Cross is a model that predicts the GDP of a country. So what is Keynesian Cross? A model that predicts GDP in a country. So to understand how Keynesian Cross is developed, we need to do a couple of different things. Small concepts, we need to understand smaller concepts which are part of Keynesian Cross before we jump onto the final model of Keynesian Cross, right? Is a model that predicts GDP of a country. So that's the bigger thing that we're moving towards. But before we jump onto this, we have to talk about consumption and saving function that we'll discuss in today's class. Okay. But obviously, the first things first. So let's talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay. Now, as I said, Keynesian Cross is a model that estimates the GDP of a country, right? Okay. Now, what is aggregate demand, right? So aggregate demand. Okay. Now have a look at this. So aggregate demand is total demand for all goods and services base aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services in a country at varying general price level. Okay, think about this. Now, if you remember the simple definition of demand, right? So we said demand is basically the total quantity demanded for a product at different price levels. So it is no different when it comes to aggregate demand. The only difference, Preet, is that in normal demand of a product, we used to look at, or we used to talk about demand for only one product, one good, one service, right? Education, healthcare, clothes, shoes, laptops, right? So one product at a time. That was normal demand, right? Now, when we talk about aggregate, that is not one product, that is the demand for all goods and services produced in a country. So what you will say, aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services produced in a country at varying general price levels, right? So think about this. When you look at the graph for aggregate demand, you would see that you have general price level on the y-axis. Now, what is general price level? I did tell you that it is not the price of one product. General price level is the average price level. General price level, average. Like what is the average prices of goods and services in a country? That is general price level. When inflation takes place in a country, general price level goes up and so on, right? So you have general price level on the y-axis, and you have aggregate demand of that country, which is the total demand for all goods and services on the x-axis, right? Now you will have a downward sloping curve. You will have a downward sloping curve. Now let's discuss what this downward sloping curve shows us. So it shows that when price level is higher, your aggregate demand would be low. Is this understandable? Why so? Think about it. When things are more expensive, obviously people will buy less goods and services, right? Because their affordability is less, right? So on point A, this much was the general price level and this much was the aggregate demand. Then when price levels drops, right? When relatively things and products become less expensive in this country, then the country's aggregate demand obviously will increase. So we call this as extension in demand. We did talk about this, right? So there would be increase in aggregate demand if general price level is decreasing. So what we understood from this is that aggregate demand and general price level, GPL, as we say in short form, GPL has inverse relationship, just like for the normal demand curve. Are you getting me? So just like the normal demand curve, except for the fact that in normal demand curve, it is only demand for one product, one good, whereas in aggregate demand, it's the demand for all goods and services that are produced in this country. Like how much will be the demand for education, plus how much will be the demand for healthcare, plus how much will be the demand for food, clothes, laptops, and all that stuff. Is this clear? So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services produced in a country at varying general price level or at different general price level, right? At varying or different general price levels, right? And we do know that aggregate demand has inverse relationship with general price level. Inverse relationship. So technically, this is all recap of AS, right? So we have not studied anything new up till now, right? But we will start off with the new, right? Okay. Now, what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply is the total supply production / supply of goods and services produced in a country different general price levels, right? Now, think about this. What is aggregate demand? Sorry, aggregate supply. It is the total production or supply of all goods and services produced, right? Produced in a country at different general price levels. So same thing what we're talking about, right? So it will show that at different price levels, how much will be the total production in an economy, right? And we do know that supply and price have direct relationship. Price and supply has direct relationship. Why? Because think about this. If something is becoming more expensive, then it means that it is becoming more profitable to produce that thing. If something is increasing, if some product's price is increasing, that means that it's now becoming more profitable to produce that good. Therefore, there will be more production. So have a look at this. If initially the general price level was, let's say, at this level, right? Then the total output produced, let's say, was this much. So this was your general price level, and this much was your aggregate supply. When later your general price level rose from GPL1 to GPL2, you can see for yourself that your aggregate supply also increased, right? Easy. Breathe. Is there any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Right. Just a second, right? So when general price level increases, your aggregate supply increases. So this shows direct relationship. And why would producers want to produce more when general price level is increasing? Because the product is becoming more profitable to produce, right? Okay, very nice. Perfect. Okay. Now let's move on and let's get started with, okay, just one thing to write. Aggregate supply has direct relationship with. Let's keep moving. Okay. Now, what we need to know is that what is aggregate demand made of? Or simply speaking, another way to ask this is, what are the components aggregate demand? What are the components of aggregate demand? Okay, think about this. So aggregate demand of a country is made up of, do you remember? You must have studied this in your AS. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So these are the components of aggregate demand. Now, what does each of these components represent? Let's talk about this, right? So aggregate demand of any country, which is the total demand for all goods and services produced, is equal to consumption, investment, government spending, plus exports minus imports, right? Now, let's look at this. What is consumption? What is consumption? So consumption is the money that we spend. We'll write down the definition of each one of these because this is very crucial component or important component of the model that we're doing. But simply speaking, consumption is the amount of money spent on buying goods and services to satisfy our needs and wants. So consumption is the money that consumers, people like you and me, and everyone else, technically everyone is a consumer, any human being is a consumer. The money that we spend in a certain time period to buy goods and services that satisfy our need and wants, that is what consumption is. Okay, now what's the next component? I'll write down the definition for each one of these, don't worry. Investment. Investment is the amount of money that businesses spend on buying capital goods. Money spent on buying capital goods. What are capital goods? Spent by firms on buying capital goods. So think about this. Capital goods are goods that you need for production of other goods, right? So what are capital goods? Any man-made products are capital goods, right? So basically tools, resources, right? So think of this. I mean, you need machinery to produce products, and this machinery would be a capital good. Similarly, the building, the office building is also a capital good because Without that building, I mean, the business cannot operate and so on, right? So capital good is any good that is needed to produce other goods and services. Okay. Then this third component in aggregate demand after consumption investment, the third one is government spending. What is government spending? Think about this. That should be very simple and intuitive to understand. Government spending is the amount of money that governments spend on different projects like education, healthcare, and things like that, right? So the money that government spends on constructing government schools, government hospitals, and things like that, infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so on, right? Then comes in this X. What is X? X is exports. So exports, we did talk about that. Exports are the products that are produced in your country, but those are bought by foreign consumers, right? Products produced in your own country, but are bought by foreign consumers. And then the fifth and the last one is imports. What are imports? Products that are produced in foreign countries, but that are bought by your consumers, So those are imports. Easy? We good on this? Any confusion, right? Okay, now let's quickly write down the definitions and then we'll keep moving forward. Okay, so C is equals to consumption, the amount on goods and services that satisfy their sum. Right? So that is what consumption is. Then I stands for investment. Spend goods on capital goods to other goods and services like machinery, building, office, building, etc. We good on this? Okay. Then G stands for government spending, refers to the amount spends on different projects, including provision of public goods. What are public goods? Right? Non-excludable and non-rivalry. Right? You would remember this from your ES level. Public goods like parks, roads, infrastructure, etc. Right? So the money that the government spends on different projects is altogether known as government spending. And what are exports? Exports are products but bought by foreign consumers, right? So that's what exports are. Then comes in imports. Imports are products produced in foreign countries but consumed in country. Got it? Easy? Okay. Now this being said, we exactly know what aggregate demand is made up of. There is no such classification for aggregate supply. So obviously we would not do that, right? So we know what aggregate demand is, what aggregate supply is. We also talked about what aggregate demand is made up of and all that stuff, right? Now do remember that all of these things that we're doing is helping us to build towards the idea of Keynesian Cross. So we could not have understood Keynesian Cross without all these things. That's why we are kind of recapping all of this, right? Okay, now comes in the next thing, which is the new concept, and that is called consumption function. Now, what is consumption function? Why are we making this? What is the idea overall? That's what we're about to look at. Now, think about this, students. What is consumption function? So, consumption function is a mathematical equation that explains, or better word would be that predicts consumers consumption level. Okay, think about this. Now, pay attention. What is consumption function? So I said consumption function is a mathematical equation that predicts a consumer's consumption levels. And what is consumption? The total amount that someone spends. So think about this. How much money do I spend each month to buy food, to buy electricity, to buy clothes, to buy fuel for my car and all that stuff. So this total amount, if I add that up, that is my consumption for the month, right? That's what you say, expenditure or consumption, whatever, right? Now, what would be consumption function? Consumption function is an equation, mathematical formula equation, whatever, right? Which we are about to see in a bit, that predicts a consumer consumption levels. Okay, now let's come over here and let's talk about this. So think about this. What do you think are the factors on which someone's consumption depends? Right? So the question here is, what are some of the main factors that you think someone's consumption depends on? So what factors decide whether someone would spend more, spend less, and so on? What do you think? What are some of the factors on which consumers' consumption depends? Can you guess? Right. So income. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a very, very important point, right? Very nice. Right. Okay. Now, the first thing is income, right? Anything else? You think, is that the only factor, or there could be other factors as well? Income. What else? Right? So income is definitely one very important factor, but obviously there are other factors, right? Trends could be income tax, right? And if government is taking more income tax, then less amount will be left for the people to spend and so on, right? Okay, now think about this. Income tax, then you're very right in saying like there could be other factors like I'm putting all the factors in one category and I'll tell you why am I doing that, right? So other factors like trends. So if something is trending more, then people will spend more on that product and so on and so forth, right? Expectations about future. So when we are more optimistic about future, like then obviously our spending is generally more and vice versa. Because when COVID hit, what happened? People got really afraid about their incomes. They became really afraid about their jobs, about they losing their jobs. And therefore they started saving more instead of spending, obviously, because they were not sure if they will be able to retain their jobs and where the world is going. So they started saving more. Obviously, it's natural. That's how humans think, right? Confidence, exactly. Other factors, trends, expectations about future, etc. Right? Okay. Now think about this. Why did we identify these factors that affect consumption, right? Because now we are about to look at the consumption function. So C is the total amount of consumption that someone undertakes. Now there is C naught. I'll tell you what the C naught is. And then there is C1 dot means multiply. So this equation that I've written over here is your consumption function. Now this might look very, new thing to you. And this might not explain anything on its own. So let me explain you that for you. Now this C naught, first of all, let's get ourselves familiar with the terminology. So this is known as, C naught is known as autonomous consumption. Now what is autonomous consumption? Let me explain that to you. Autonomous consumption is, in fact, let me write it down over here, right? So autonomous consumption is component of consumption that does not depend on income level. Instead, it depends on factors like expectations of the future, trends, income tax, etc. Okay, think about this. Breathe. Now, the wording is very important over here, and that's why I'm making you familiar with the wording early on. So what is autonomous consumption? Think about it. So autonomous consumption, I said, is the component of consumption that does not depend on income levels, and instead it depends on factors like expectations about the future, trends, income tax, etc. So these other factors that we identify, these factors will affect your autonomous consumption. So these are basically factors that affect your, these are the factors that affect your autonomous consumption, right? And component of consumption, what's the other factor that affects consumption? So some we have already listed down, and we said that this would be part of autonomous consumption. This other factor, which is the main factor which affects consumption, is income. This is known as induced consumption, right? Now, this is some special wording that economists use to differentiate between autonomous and induced consumption. So do remember that component of consumption that depends on other factors like income tax, trends, expectations about future, etc. Right? So these are autonomous. This is called autonomous consumption, and the consumption that depends on income levels of an individual, that's known as induced consumption. Right? So let's write this down over here. Right? So autonomous consumption is the component of consumption that does not depend on income level, and instead it depends on factors like expectations about the future, trends, income tax, etc. Then the other component, which we call induced consumption, that depends on profit. Does it make sense? Now you'll see in a bit that why was it important to differentiate between autonomous and induced consumption, right? So you'll see in a bit, right? But before that, remember that what is the consumption function? So consumption function is basically, right? Okay. Now this is the consumption function, which I wrote over here. So what does it says? C is the total consumption. So total consumption is equals to C naught, which is autonomous consumption, plus C1. What is C1? I'll tell you in a bit. C1 multiplied. So this dot over here that I've written, that means multiply, right? So think about this. So as I showed you over here, so this is your consumption function. What is this showing you? Have a look at this. That the total consumption of an individual is made up of two components. C naught, which is autonomous consumption, and C1 plus Y. C1 not plus, sorry, C1 into Y, into means multiply. And this entire component is known as induced consumption. Okay, now let's move a little forward and let's talk about C1. Now think about this. If your parents give you pocket money, right? Or let's say if someone earns, your parents earn some income. Let's think about this. Any individual, let's think of any individual, XYZ. That person earns some income. What are the ways, what are some of the ways that what are some of the ways in which that person can spend his or her income, right? So if someone is earning some income, right? So let's say if I'm working, so what are the options that I have available? How can I make use of my income? What will I do? What are all the possibilities if I ask you like that, right? So basically rent, fee makes sense. But what am I doing? So when I pay all these expenses, right? You're very right. So what are the two options? Basically think about this, like put them in broad categories, please. So what is all of this? Paying the fee, paying for the fuel, paying for the food, paying for the rent. What are all these things called, right? Spending and saving. Exactly. Excellent, right? So if you think of any person on this planet, the only two ways that someone can spend his or her income is to consume, spend, basically consume or spend, same thing, right? Either that person can consume, which is called consumption, like buy goods and services that satisfy the need, or save some of that for future use, which is known as savings, right? So income would always be equal to, right? So how much you spend in a time period plus how much you saved in a certain time period, you add these two variables up, you will get the income. Okay, now think about this. Now, the idea is that if I write, let's write it down over here. So if I change this equation a little bit. And on the left-hand side, instead of income, I write additional income, right? What are we doing with this? You'll just see in a bit. So I am just rephrasing or rearranging this upper equation, right? So let's say this is equation 1. So in this above equation, we saw that income of an individual would always be equals to consumption, how much money he spent on buying different goods and services, and how much money he saved. So consumption plus savings is your income. Now in the second equation, have a look at this. Additional income would be equal to what? Additional consumption. So the additional income of an individual would either be spent more on consumption or it would be saved. Is this making sense? Right? Breathe. So, I mean, this second equation that I've written in front of you, it's very similar to what I wrote above there. But the only difference is that with each of the three variables, I've used the word additional. So whatever additional income someone earns, either that would be utilized towards consumption, which we can define as additional consumption, or that would be used for savings, which we can define as additional savings. Easy? We good on this? Okay. Now, what do we call additional savings? Now, this is something that you have to pay close attention to, right? So, marginal propensity to save, right? Now, again, these are some new words and new terms for you, so you have to pay close attention. Marginal propensity to save is the word that we use for additional savings. Marginal propensity to save. Now, we can also write this as MPS, marginal propensity to save. Now, what is this? Marginal propensity to save is the proportion of additional income that is saved. Is the proportion of additional income of an individual which is saved. Right? Just give me a second. Is additional income of an individual which is saved. Easy? Is it simple? Any confusion so far? Okay, now that's the first thing. Right, I'll write this down, right? Now, what is marginal propensity to save? We just talked about it. We said that marginal propensity to save is the additional income that is saved, right? Okay, now, just a second. So the formula that we first wrote was income is equals to consumption plus savings, right? And then the second formula that we wrote was additional income is equals to additional consumption plus additional income plus additional savings. Got it? Okay. Now what is additional savings? Right? So that's the first thing that we talked about. This is known as marginal propensity to save. So what is marginal propensity to save? Portion of additional income that is saved, right? And how do we write it? Think about this. So we would write marginal propensity to save as MPS, marginal propensity to save is change in savings. So what is delta? By now you would be very familiar with this delta, which means savings, change in savings due to change in income is the way you calculate MPS, right? So change in savings due to change in income is known as your marginal propensity to save. Does it make sense? Right? Then similarly, you have marginal propensity to consume, right? MPC. So what is marginal propensity to consume? Have a look at this. How much will be the change in consumption due to change in income? That would be your, how much would be the change in consumption due to change in income? That would be your marginal propensity to consume, right? Is it making sense? So have a look at this. So additional consumption is defined as marginal propensity to consume, which is basically the proportion additional income that is spent, or you can say consumed. This is making sense. Now have a look at this. We have looked at the formulas for both marginal propensity to consume, which is change in consumption due to change in income, change in consumption divided by change in income. And we also looked at marginal propensity to save, which is basically change in savings due to change in income. Now you have to look at this very carefully. Now, since every other dollar that you earn, or every other rupee or whatever, euro, whatever the currency is, that doesn't make any difference. Every additional dollar that I earn, I will either be consuming that or I will be saving that. Do you agree with me? Preet? So since every other dollar that I earn, right, I have only two options with that. I can either consume that, spend that dollar onto buying some goods and services that I need, or I can save that dollar for future use. So therefore, it means that marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save will always be equals to 1. So let me give you an example. So if I say that my marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, what it shows actually that out of one additional dollar, I will spend 60 cents and I will save how much? And I will save how much? Breathe. I will save 40 cents out of one additional dollar, right? So I will save 40 cents out of one additional dollar. So marginal propensity to consume 0.6 means that out of each additional dollar, I'll spend 60 cents, and marginal propensity to save would obviously then be 0.4, or you can also write this down as 40%, right? So you can also think of it as 40% because out of every additional dollar, you save 40% of it. And similarly, in this case, out of every additional dollar, you spend 60% of it, right? Is it making sense? So your marginal propensity to consume is 60% and your marginal propensity to save is 40%. Read? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me? Right? We're good on this? Breathe. Okay, great. So Preet, there is some work going on in my home and I have to kind of supervise it. So I know we could have had longer class today, but don't worry, we'll have a longer class in the coming 1 or 2 days, right? So we'll stop here for today and tomorrow we'll continue from it, right? Thank you so much. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Allah Hafiz. Bye.